G'day and welcome to Talking Leadership. This is Eric Perez, and we continue with our development of podcasts around this leadership issue. And today I've got the pleasure to be joined by a CEO in the agriculture sector. I'll introduce my podcast guests and get straight into the questions. So today's guest is the Chief Executive Officer at the Australian Dairy Farmers. Can I welcome to the podcast David Inall? How are you, David?
I'm very well, thank you, Eric. How are you?
I'm fantastic, sir. Thank you for joining me today. Look, I appreciate your time. I know this time of year gets busy, and like all parts of the ag sector, it's never a dull moment for us getting by with issues of the day. So, look, I do appreciate your time. And let me start you on the podcast questions with where I start always is, in which industry was your first leadership role, David, and why did you take on that role?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I've probably unintentionally, but I have focused my career on those staple food items of meat, milk and eggs. And I've moved around between a number of agricultural sectors, mostly in the cattle industry. Plus, I also had 5 years in the egg industry in the United States. But my first leadership role in terms of at the CEO level was as the Chief Executive Officer of the Cattle Council of Australia, which is similar to my current role, but in the beef industry. And I commenced that role in 2005, and that was in Canberra. So I moved from Sydney to Canberra and moved a young family down there to take up that role.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so you've had a lot of experience in the Australian agriculture sector. So, listen, just as a follow-on to that, and it's a nice segue. Given those experiences you've had, do you see a difference in your travels between the leadership function and the management function?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, management is clearly an important. It's intrinsically connected to the daily business of whatever that business is. So, organisations like ours typically employ a range of people who, whether it's accounts or administration, there's a range of management functions that need to be undertaken in organisations, and at the CEO level, of course. You need to provide management oversight, and I find that's mostly around the people management. So there's the typical building blocks of any organisation, whether it's finance, whether it's media, whether it's member services with the type of work we do. But for me, what I learned early on in my career, a mentor once said to me, when I was seeking some guidance on a particular matter, he reminded me we were in the people business. And I thought I was in the cattle industry at that time. And then I was reminded I was in the people business. And ever since then, I saw, yes, there are a lot of management issues around people. However, leadership is that next level where you are expected typically to make decisions. Now, in the case of agricultural organisations, we're guided by policies that are set by our members. But in my early days as a CEO of the Cattle Council, I remember sitting in a meeting and difficult questions were being asked, and I was sitting there thinking, gee, I'm not sure who's going to answer those. And I remembered that was my job to answer those. And that was, as the CEO, you then have to step up into that leadership role and form a narrative around your positions as an organisation, which cover the whole country.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and that wraps those two up. I guess it's the response you've given, and I appreciate your candour is pretty typical of what the distinction between those two functions are. So let me bring you back to your function as a leader, and the next statement's around making mistakes. So how do you engage with an error or a mistake that's attributed to your leadership, David?
So I think I look at that probably no different than how a court of law would look at it. If in a court of law, the way I see from governance, particularly around governance, is how an organisation or an individual responds when they identify the error. And typically, if you respond in a positive and constructive manner, that's going to make life easier for you. So I always find this is going to sound cliched, but you don't try and wallpaper over it. If you've said something that was inaccurate, or you've inadvertently misled somebody, or you've done something you shouldn't have done, for me, you just immediately correct that, and you'll say, "Hey, I got that wrong," or "I thought that our position was X, but it was actually Y." And there's even been times in the media, we do a lot of media here, or I certainly do. And there are times when I've gone back to journalists and said, "Hey, look, I know I've just done this interview, but really, this is actually more accurate than what I've said because I just found that out. So I just think it's don't make excuses. Nobody expects you to know everything. In fact, early on in my career, a mentor said to me, if you don't know the answer to something, tell them you don't know the answer. 100% of the time that'll work for you. And I found that to be right. And you just fess up and correct it and move on.
Yeah, okay. And that's good advice for anyone in that leadership space. So again, in your travels, what have you found to be the most difficult part of being a leader?
That's a really interesting question, and there's so many parts to that. I'm going to come at it through a few different angles, Eric. One of them is, and this is not meant to, cry in my beer here, but it can be lonely in this position. You find, you know who your friends are and you know who your supporters are. So one of it is making decisions when you're on your own. It's getting out there and being the case of the roles that I've held, when you're the industry spokesperson for a national industry, you do get a lot of pressure on you, and every word can be prosecuted and cross-examined. So it's pressure. It's pressure to be precise and accurate and be sure that you are clearly sticking with policy. And another one, of course, is I come back to that earlier comment around the people management. Is every employee you have their own bring their own value to the table, and I always try and support them. But there are just times when you find yourself in a position where you need to make difficult decisions around staff as well, and I find that always a challenge, but you get through it.
Yeah, again, something to take away from that, and I would tend to agree, and it's come up in some of the podcasts around the leadership role can be a lonely path to tread, particularly in your position being a national spokesman for an industry group. I can't myself relate to some of those stresses because I work for a state body. We do have a national peak body, and it helps someone like me get some insights into the person who's running our national seafood body. Her name is Jane Lovell, and she's probably under exceptional pressures that some of us in the state bodies may not actively be thinking about, but and not to understand the pressures that go with these jobs. But I would say quite clearly that as a national spokesman, there is a different focus on what you do, and there'll be more scrutiny to what you say, particularly in the media. So let's for the sake of moving away from what could be construed as negatives, how do you, in your role as a leader, measure success, David?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of measures of success. Staff retention is one, and I've worked for organisations where I've seen staff turnover, and that is often related to an office culture or people just not feeling that they're valued or supported, or they don't necessarily align with the business. So that's one, is if you can stabilise staff turnover and get that retention up high, I think that's a good success. That's some measure of success. Another one most definitely is in the world that I work in is definitely things like government decisions that are supportive of your industry, and being able to demonstrate to your board and to your members that you have access into decision makers. They rely on you for advice. They don't always take your advice or the industry's advice, but at least they know that members know that it's been factored in when governments or regulators are making decisions. That's also important, and also being able to manage negativity and negative press. And we, I'm currently being in the dairy industry. It's top of mind for many people in Canberra right now and all around the country. It's been getting significant amount of publicity as the industry goes through a difficult time, not just due to drought, but low prices as well. And the way in which we manage some of that negativity and some of that, challenging media of farm exits and things like that. People watch people like me to see how we respond in that time of pressure. And I also see a measure of success is being able to navigate our way through that. Not always, for me, I'm passionate about not always falling for joining in the chorus sometimes of negative press. We try and pivot that to what are the opportunities for the industry, or how can we do things better, how can we do things differently, being able to go to Canberra with solutions rather than problems. I think these are all mix around how I would want people to measure someone like myself, and how if I was a member of a member organisation, they're the sort of things I'd be looking for.
Excellent. So got a couple of statements here that I'm seeking your views on, David. The first is, on-the-job experience develops better leaders.
Yeah, so it definitely, you do need to understand the business. You do. I have seen in some industries, I've seen people come in to take leadership positions who don't have the background in that industry. And while generic leadership experience takes you some of the way, the bottom line is there are lots of moving parts in any industry, regardless of what it is. And I think it definitely being able to understand those moving parts and have had some of that on-the-job experience through the different parts of the supply chain does add value. I do think that's that's not all you need. You do need to have some basic personality and drive around leadership, which I'm sure we'll get to maybe a bit later in this discussion. But on-the-job experience definitely does help.
Okay, so the connected statement that comes next is, formal education helps to develop better leaders.
So I have found myself, I'm someone with just a regular ag science degree and the company director's course. I always find opportunities to go and do some additional training when I get the chance. And I find formal education gives you some tips and tools, definitely gives you some tools but I think that's only part of the story. It's I don't overplay the need for formal education in terms of developing better leaders, because I think that most leaders have either got it in them or they haven't.
Excellent. That gives me some insights into the last statement here. Leaders are born, not made. What's your view on that statement?
Yeah, I think it's, I'm not sure. Is it your personality is pretty much enshrined at about the age of 15 or 16? And I think definitely leaders, you can go and do leadership training, sure. But to me, your brand and your style is your personality. And I can definitely see, I work with some very, very smart, I have over my career worked with some very smart people, but I don't necessarily think they would be ideal in the leadership space, because leaders need to be open-minded, welcoming other people's views, being able to form consensus, build alliances and allegiances, and those sorts of things to me are key parts of being a leader. And I find that there are a number of people who, while being highly intelligent and good at what they do, don't necessarily bring that to the table. So I'm probably more of the view that leaders, you're either born with that particular streak in you or you're not. Doesn't mean that you can't be augmented with on-the-job experience and some training to be better at it. But I feel like some of the best leaders I've worked with are people that I have a sense just had it in their DNA.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. For personally, I'm still on the fence. In some respects, it's leaders travel, so you've had an interesting career pathway, and I've met with other leaders in my own travels that have had similar interesting career pathways, and some are adamant that the best leaders are just naturally gifted and they just get better as time goes on, versus those that are of the complete opposite school, that you can provide training and experiences to someone and create a good leader. I think you can do both, but look, I've often been blamed for being offensive, but on that one, I've seen too much in my travels to suggest it's one extreme or the other. But that's again, all of this stuff is personal perspective, so I don't think there's ever been a right or wrong answer, and it's always an interesting question to throw up to people who've had the level of experience that you've had, David.
So, David, I'm looking at strategic thinking and foresight as critical leader capabilities, and it appears in the literature that this is being strongly supported. I'm just trying to seek your view of these two capabilities in terms of your experience in organisations.
Look, I absolutely think it's critical. No question. I think both of those, I think you've nailed it with those 2 points, strategic thinking and foresight. Being a strategic thinker and being able to, I find a lot of people that I've seen worked with in my career, you need to get from A to B, and they just think it's just a straight line, and there's a bit of a crash. It can at times. You can see a bit of a crash through mentality. Strategic thinking is, what's the best way to get from A to B, and it might not necessarily be in a straight line. And as I mentioned in earlier question, it could be around, who are like-minded organisations or individuals that we can partnership, maybe a coalition of the willing that can help us get there. What are some key steps that we need to make to get us there, which might be more around member engagement, more around getting members involved in different parts of our business to help us to get to that point, rather than just thinking, one person can get it done. And foresight as well is, looking ahead and saying, well, what does this mean now? I mean, if we were to make a certain decision now, what does that mean going forward? What are the implications? And I think we always should do a simple, either just a SWOT analysis, even just quickly on the whiteboard, the risks and opportunities. What are the opportunities and downsides of doing something, making decisions, or if we go to government with a certain position, what are the unintended consequences? So these are all, I find that I really enjoy those discussions. And when you sit around an empty whiteboard and you've got to start filling it up, you can see those people who have got things to say and ideas, rather than, let's just write a letter to the government and tell them what they need to do. It's a lot more to it than that, and requires bit more of a chessboard. There's sort of I always think of a chessboard and which pieces we're moving to get to the end, rather than just, bowling ball right down the middle.
Sure. Thank you for the analogy. That makes a lot of sense. Look, the final question I've got here for you, David, it's about your experiences. What might you say to a younger version of yourself about being an effective leader?
Look, that's a really good question. I'm thinking as to what if my younger version was sitting right here. I think I would provide support. I would say you can do it. I would remind myself of the need to have as many mentors around you as you can. So you can pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm not really travelling too well today, or I'm feeling like I'm in a real jam, or I feel like I could have done a certain thing better, or I didn't communicate this well, and you just get some advice from somebody. And too many people think they just got to go it alone. So definitely having mentors is important. I think having a somewhat of a career plan is also very important. But mostly for me, it's about surrounding yourself. I would impress upon the younger version of myself to do everything I could to surround myself with people who I thought brought different skills to the table than what I have. Look at things a little differently. I have seen leaders in the past who like to put on other staff who are very similar to themselves, and we all have different strengths and weaknesses, and making sure that you've got that full spectrum around you, I think is really important.
Thank you, David. And for those podcast listeners, I've been speaking with the Australian Dairy Farmers CEO, Mr. David Inall. David, I appreciate your time.
No problem. Thank you, Eric.